Okay, good evening, everybody. It is time to finish up the 10th chapter of The Problem of Slavery in the Age of Revolution. All day long, I had it in my head that I was going to finish the book tonight, but that is not correct. I am finishing the 10th chapter. Then we have the 11th chapter and the epilogue for Friday. It's a short enough chapter. I think I'll be able to do it all in one reading plus read the epilogue, which is only a couple of pages. So it'll be a longer read, but probably like 2 hours. But then we'll be done with this book. And then we can start the new book in the new year, which is perfect. All right, so we're going to finish up the second half of the 10th chapter. So we were on page 497. This is Anti-Slavery and the Conflict of Laws was the name of this chapter. So here we go. Mansfield's own position was less than clear. In the Lewis case of 1771, he endorsed the principle of in favorem libertatis, but also accepted the possibility that even in England a master might prove ownership of a Negro. He refused to make any judgments as to law, leaving it for the jury to decide whether in fact Thomas Lewis was the property of Robert Stapleton, or whether after being captured by a Spanish ship and after working for wages in various colonies, he had been a free man when seized by Stapleton. Wow, that hit me all of a sudden. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Um, as Sharp wrote, wow. Man, that came on sudden. Ah, okay. Whether Thomas Lewis was the property of Robert Stapleton, or whether, after being captured by a Spanish ship and after working for wages in various colonies, he had been a free man when seized by Stapleton. As Sharp wrote in indignation, quote, "It is plain his lordship was willing to presume that the idea of the master's property in the boy, capital B, was sufficient to justify such violent outrages if it could have been proved," end quote. Further, Mansfield confided to Dunning that, quote, "Ever since that trial, I have had a great doubt in my mind whether the Negro could prove his own freedom by his own evidence, whether a slave may be a witness to prove himself free," end quote. Excuse me. I'll get over it here in a minute, but man, sorry to keep coughing in your ears, people. All right. Stuart may have been unwise to claim Somerset as his slave. Since this narrowed Mansfield's options, Mansfield could either discharge Somerset, which might result, he feared, in a loss of some £700,000 sterling to the owners of resident slaves, or he could give legal recognition to a form of unrestricted dominion which clearly ran counter to a century or more of political ideology. Mansfield bowed to this ideology when he said that, quote, "the meanest Briton would take fire," end quote, "at the sight of a merchant selling African slaves in England in open market." He affirmed the right of asylum and held that English law would protect a galley slave who had escaped from Europe. At first, he also seemed to extend the question to, quote, "whether any dominion, authority, or coercion can be exercised in this country on a slave according to the American laws," end quote. Yet he paid tribute to York and Talbot, quote, "two of the greatest men of their own or any times who had pledged themselves to the British planters for the legal consequences of bringing Negro slaves into this kingdom or their being baptized. End quote. He summarized their opinions together with Hardwick's unpublished equity judgment in Pern versus Lyle. Most important, Mansfield's famous words about quote to so sorry quote so high an act of dominion end quote referred not to slavery but to the specific question of forcibly confining a slave aboard a ship in order to be sold overseas. The only question adjudicated was whether Captain Knowles' cause was sufficient for the detainer of Somerset, and the cause stated, quote, that he had kept him by order of his master with an intent to send him abroad to Jamaica, there to be sold, end quote. Mansfield did not deny the legality of, quote, the power of a master over his servant, but simply said that the exercise of it must always be regulated by the laws of the place where exercised, end quote. Despite the eloquent arguments of Somerset's counsel, which even courts soon confused with the decision itself, one must conclude that English quote unquote judge found law did not totally dissolve the pre existing relationship between a master and his slave. This view was confirmed by William versus Brown in 1802 and received solid substantiation in 1827 in the Court of Admiralty. Lord Stowell, the judge in the latter case, termed himself a stern abolitionist with respect to the slave trade. Yet 6 years prior to British emancipation, he felt it his duty to clarify the misrepresentations of Somerset. A domestic slave named Grace Jones had been taken to England in 1822 and had been transported back to Antigua the following year. In 1825, a customs official seized her on the ground that she had been free in England and had thus been imported illegally. Lord Stowell, upholding the verdict of the Vice Admiralty Court in Antigua, ruled that she was still a slave. Somerset's counsel had actually anticipated and tried to refute Lord Stowell's line of reasoning. Sergeant Davy attacked the absurdity of Virginia's law of 1704, which stated that slavery would reattach to any returning Negro who had been temporarily enfranchised as a result of being in England. Hargrave observed that it would have been more artful if Stuart had merely cited slavery, quote, as a ground for claiming Somerset here in the relation of a servant bound to follow wherever his master should require his service, end quote. In other words, Stuart might have conceded that a Negro brought to England would enjoy certain protection of law, but that unconditional slavery would reattach as soon as the Negro left the jurisdiction of municipal law. Hargrave exposed the illogic of this position. How could English law prohibit the introduction of slavery and yet give effect to even an implicit contract founded on slavery? English law must confer the gift of liberty, quote, entire and unencumbered, end quote. The law, said Hargrave, would, quote, not permit slavery suspended for a while, suspended during the pleasure of the master, end quote. Yet this was precisely the point Mansfield refused to adjudicate. Lord Stowell pointed out that transmarine law had never recognized the common law principle, quote, once free for an hour, free forever, end quote. The maxim had applied only to English villeins. I still don't know how to pronounce that correctly, but it's Villeins. That's why I pronounce it villeins, and I don't know if that's correct. Anyway, Stowell acknowledged that Grace Jones might have chosen to remain in England as a free woman, yet the legal rights she possessed there expired with her residence. The Somerset decision according to Stoll, implied no more than the suspension of colonial slave codes during a temporary residence in England. He complained that Lord Mansfield, after trying to avoid a decision and seeking a compromise settlement out of court, had failed to correct the misinterpretations of law which he had helped introduce. The quote unquote limited liberation conferred upon slaves in England, Stoll wrote, had never altered their status upon returning to the colonies. Joseph Story, the eminent American authority on conflict of law, praised Stoll's decision as impregnable, quote unquote. The Grace decision reconciled conflicting domestic and imperial interests in a way that helps to tie together our discussion of dominion. The Somerset case is obviously far better known, for it provided a forum for Sharp and Hargrave and soon became celebrated as a major victory for the humanitarian conscience. The 1772 decision proved reassuringly that England was a free country, that workers and servants were responsible for their own welfare, and that the principle of voluntarism limited both the dominion and responsibility of masters. If the law itself had adhered closely to this libertarian philosophy, it would have posed a direct challenge to colonial institutions. The law, therefore, had to balance the needs of domestic ideology against commercial and imperial interests. Within the British Empire, there was no sharp division, as in the later United States, between a permanent slaveholding class and the owners of other property. The law could gravitate easily toward a pragmatic middle ground, partly through popular misinterpretations. The Somerset case fulfilled the needs of domestic ideology. In practice, however, a slave's dependency did not cease when he breathed English air. In 1785, Lord Mansfield admitted that when, quote, slaves have been brought here and have commenced actions for their wages, I have always non-suited the plaintiff, end quote. In the notorious Zong case of 1783, Mansfield had no doubt that, so far as insurance claims were concerned, quote, the case of the slaves was the same as if horses had been thrown overboard, end quote. English law was flexible enough to recognize the validity of slave property, to uphold contracts for the sale of slaves, and to provide room for a qualified servitude, even a servitude without wages. It simply told masters that they should not repeat Stuart's mistake of locking a slave in irons for forcible shipment out of the country. No doubt the Somerset decision deterred many West Indians from bringing their slaves to England, and those who did were more careful to choose obedient servants or to secure signed indentures. The important point, however, is that regardless of legal forms, English courts endorsed no principles that undermined colonial slave law. For a time, then, the two systems of law could coexist and even interpenetrate within the larger imperial sphere. Conflicting jurisdictions. The jurisdictional questions concerning slavery fall into three broad categories: those that involved international law and international relations, those that arose from the French and British imperial systems, and those resulting from the demarcation of free and slave states within the United States. I shall touch on the international conflicts very briefly, observing only that national policy depended on changing circumstance. A few random examples will illustrate this point. During the late 18th century, large numbers of Jamaican slaves escaped to Cuba in fishing boats. Partly as a legacy of the earlier Anglo-Spanish wars, Cuban officials held out the offer of freedom to any fugitive who professed the Catholic faith, although Cuban planters were also happy to buy slaves from Jamaica in an illicit trade that the Spanish crown was powerless to stop. Despite the establishment of police patrols, the Jamaican government could not stem the flow of fugitives, which threatened to drain the manpower of plantations along the northern coast. They sent repeated remonstrances and even delegations to the governors of Havana and to St. Jago de Cuba, who gravely replied that they had no authority to return fugitives who had come seeking the true faith. In petitions to the English king and council, the Jamaicans denounced this pretext of religion and claimed that the slaves who had been lured to Cuba by false promises of freedom would, if permitted, happily return to their former masters. In 1790, British diplomacy appeared to succeed. Following the Nootka Sound crisis, which brought England and Spain to the brink of war, Spain agreed that henceforth there would be no more harboring of fugitive slaves. Yet by 1792, the Jamaican press reported that the Spanish were smuggling arms to British slaves, telling them that the kings of Spain and England favored their emancipation. The two nations were soon again at war. The next examples show how quickly British attitudes could be transformed. In 1807, both the governor and the Supreme Court of Michigan Territory refused to return fugitive slaves who had fled from Upper Canada, since the United States Constitution imposed no obligation to surrender runaway slaves to a foreign nation. But by 1829, the Executive Council of Upper Canada had ruled that every slave who entered the province was free. Quote, whether he has been brought in by violence or has entered of his own accord, end quote. Extradition of fugitives could apply only to crimes which were mala in se and which were recognized in Canada and throughout the civilized world. In 1837, John C. Calhoun persuaded the United States Senate to pass a resolution demanding the return of any American slave who claimed freedom as a result of setting foot on foreign soil. Under Article 10 of the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, 1842, the British agreed to extradite persons charged with felonies, including assault, robbery, and forgery, charges which few fugitives could hope to escape. But in 1842, Lord Aberdeen defended the action of Nassau officials who refused to return some American slaves who had seized control of a sloop and had sailed it to the island after killing one master. A Nassau judge held that blacks could justifiably commit homicide to gain their freedom. By the time Britain had extinguished slavery in her own Caribbean colonies, she was prepared to take the highest moral ground in refusing to return American slaves who had escaped to Canada or the Bahamas. Yet during the Age of Revolution, it is difficult to think of British armies fighting for the common rights of mankind. One may grant that English generals promised freedom to large numbers of American fugitives during both the Revolution and the War of 1812. Commitments which led to bitter and prolonged negotiations for restitution. But American loyalists transported substantial numbers of slaves to Canada, and in striking contrast to the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, the British Imperial Act of 1790 intended to encourage immigration to Canada, the Bahamas, and Bermuda, allowed free importation of all quote, Negroes, household furniture, utensils of husbandry, or clothing, end quote. It was not an army of liberation that Pitt dispatched to rebellious St. Domingue, nor did the British, when they captured Martinique in 1795, intend to implement the French Convention's recent decree of universal emancipation. There were no universally accepted principles of international law that provided judges with coherent rules for reconciling conflicts between divergent social and legal systems. On the one hand, the Roman and common law traditions posited a, quote, supranational body of shared concepts and legal presuppositions, end quote, which could resolve conflicts between independent legal systems. On the other hand, in the Netherlands and to some extent in Britain, quote, the sense of a shared universal natural law gave way to an assertion of independent state power and freedom from supranatural restraints. In place of supranational obligation, the Dutch developed a notion of comity, comitus gentium, which each nation of its own free will might grant recognition of foreign rights and duties in the interest of harmony and in the expectation of reciprocity. End quote. Britain's continuing involvement with Negro slavery, coupled with the vicissitudes of war and diplomacy, made it difficult to assimilate abolitionist principles to a supranational body of law, as distinct from the municipal law that might grant asylum to fugitives. Moreover, Anglo American jurists showed increasing respect for a positivistic conception of law as the expression of the legislator's will and looked to natural law for an orienting set of principles when statutes and case law provided no guidance. Nevertheless, Anglo-American attempts to suppress the slave trade encouraged a few eminent judges to move in a more universalistic direction. In 1812, the English Court of Appeals appeared to recognize a higher law that bound all nations. At issue was whether a British warship had the right to seize an American slave ship, in this case the Amity, noting that both England and the United States had passed municipal laws against the trade. The court admitted that, quote, we cannot legislate for other countries, but concluded that this is a trade which cannot, abstractly speaking, be said to have a legitimate existence, end quote. William Roscoe, the Liverpool abolitionist, rejoiced at the reported dictum that, quote, by the law of nature and nations there can be no property in human beings, end quote. In a letter to the Duke of Gloucester, titular head of the prestigious African institution, Roscoe wrote, quote, this decision appears to be fully to sanction the opinion in which I observe your Royal Highness concurs, vis-a-vis that it can be no breach of the law of nations to prevent other countries from a practice which we have ourselves relinquished as contrary to justice and humanity. That this country ought not to legislate for others, I perfectly agree, but the laws and regulations of other states, in order to be respected, ought to be consistent with the rules of justice and humanity, or in other words, with the common rights of mankind. End quote. In the American case of La, I'm going to just say June Eugenie, because I'm going to butcher it anyway, so I might as well just butcher it. In the case of Lejeune Eugenie, 1822, Justice Joseph Story took similar ground and asserted his right to enforce an anti-slavery law of nations, quote, unless it is relaxed or waived by the consent of nations, end quote. It thus appeared that both British and American courts were prepared to uphold a universal and supranational law against slave trading unless the defendants could prove that the practice was legal under the laws of their own countries. Yet both the British and American decisions were soon reversed. In the British case of Lewis, um, 1817, the Court of an Admiralty ruled that only French courts could enforce French law, and that it, quote, would have been deemed a most extravagant assumption in any court of the law of nations to pronounce that this practice, the tolerated and the approved, the encouraged object of law, ever since men became subject to law, was prohibited by that law and was legally criminal, end quote. Chief Justice John Marshall, with Justice Story now concurring, came to a similar judgment in the Antelope. That's the word. 1825. Thus, the Columbia Law Review has concluded, quote, in spite of Story's early attempt to foster a universal and normative law of slavery, American courts arrived at essentially the same conclusions reached by the British courts. The law of nations was, in effect, a neutral force, itself subordinate to municipal law, end quote. Within their own imperial system, the French faced jurisdictional problems quite similar to those of the British. If the British were contemptuously amused by pretensions of liberty in Bourbon France, they also found in the names of les causes célèbres seeming precedents for the Somerset and Knight decisions. Thus, the quote memorials, quote unquote, I guess it's just one word, memorials, filed in the Knight case quoted such sterling maxims as something in French. Um, I'm not even going to try it. I don't recognize enough words in it to try to translate it. Um, and there's a whole bunch of it. There's like three short quotes in a row. I'm not understanding enough of it. Sorry. Of course, the Code Noir of 1685 authorized chattel slavery in the colonies, but numerous slaves won their freedom for one reason or another after being taken to the metropolis. The French crown tried to prevent such actions by an edict of 1716 and a declaration of 1738. Under these laws, masters could bring slaves to the metropolis for the purposes of religious instruction or learning a trade, but the owners were required to post bond and to register each slave with the port authorities. The 1738 declaration prohibited slaves from marrying and required their return to the colonies after a sojourn of 3 years. Slaves could not be manumitted except by testament upon a master's death, but could be set free if an owner failed to comply with the regulations. This was apparently the ground for most of the successful freedom suits, although the Parliament of Paris recognized constitutional appeals for freedom within its own jurisdiction. The confusion over grounds for emancipation was compounded in 1762 by the celebrated case of Louis, in which appeals to a municipal tradition of freedom were mixed with warnings that an influx of Negroes would disfigure the nation. Louis won his freedom along with back wages for the work he had performed since arriving in France from Saint Domingue. But the growing fear of racial intermixture led to ordinances that were designed to keep France not only free but racially pure as well. England never enacted a slave code for her colonies. Consequently, the sanction for slavery was not so explicit as in France, nor was there so formal a recognition of the divergence between metropolitan and colonial institutions. Sergeant William Davie argued that, quote, "the king makes laws for Virginia alone if he pleases, but he cannot make laws here without the consent and authority of the two houses of Parliament," end quote. Hence the laws of Virginia had no more influence or authority in England, quote, "than the laws of Japan," end quote. Yet when the British colonies codified their own slave laws, usually long after slavery had taken root, there was a presumption that the local codes were not repugnant to common law or to the British Constitution. Indeed, under William III, the government explicitly ruled that colonial legislators could enact no statutes repugnant to the law of England. It was this principle that led Lord Chancellor Hardwicke to conclude that if Negro slaves were free when brought to England, which he denied, then they must also be free in the colonies. By the 1780s, a few writers were bold enough to assert that the Somerset decision had proved the illegality of slavery in any British dominion, but since the Crown had shown far less interest in slave codes than in disallowing colonial attempts to restrict slave imports, it was no less logical to assume that the institution was legal unless prohibited by positive law. This view, the precise opposite of Mansfield's supposed dictum is given some credence by the early attempts to outlaw slavery. In 1652, a rump decision of the Rhode Island General Court thought it necessary to prohibit slavery by local statute, but the ruling was never enforced. In 1735, the trustees of Georgia secured a special law from Parliament which, on grounds of military defense and social utility, made slavery illegal in that colony. The law was soon repealed, a fact that underscores the local and temporal character of slave prohibition. After independence, 5 northern states adopted laws for gradual emancipation. These statutes, by their very nature, confirmed the legality of past and continuing enslavement. Of course, many Negroes won individual freedom suits in the South as well as in the North. In granting such freedom, judges sometimes referred to the natural law principles of the Revolution, although this tendency waned during the early 19th century as courts adopted stricter rules in weighing evidence, reputation, and ancestry, and paid greater deference to legislative policy concerning manumission and public liability for the indigent. Vermont stood alone in outlawing slavery by a constitution that embodied principles of higher law justice. In Massachusetts, Levi Lincoln's brief for Quock Walker appeared to paraphrase the arguments of Francis Hargrave and proclaimed that, quote, the air in America is too pure for a slave to breathe in, end quote. Chief Justice William Cushing's instructions to the jury in Commonwealth versus Jennison, 1783, suggested that, quote, the idea of slavery is inconsistent with our own conduct and constitution, end quote. Yet the issue of constitutionality remained unclear, even if Massachusetts could legitimately claim to be the only state that eradicated slavery by judicial action. Nevertheless, in both England and America, the opinion gradually prevailed that slavery was an exceptional or artificial institution that required the sanction of positive law. This view is partly the result of misinterpretations of the Somerset decision. Lord Mansfield had apparently limited himself to the point that, quote, the state of slavery is of such a nature that it is incapable of being now introduced by courts of justice upon mere reasoning or inferences from any principles, natural or political, end quote. It is true that Justice Lemuel Shaw later qualified the positive law doctrine by noting that, quote, positive law in this connection may be as well understood customary law, as the enactment of a statute, and the word is used to designate rules established by tacit acquiescence, end quote. Presumably, this definition was elastic enough to apply to any territory where slavery had taken root and had not been expressly prohibited. But as generally understood, the positive law doctrine meant, as interpreted in Michigan Territory, that, quote, as rights of property in persons cannot exist by the common law, but only by statute, the manner of protecting such rights must be regulated by statute. Common law principles do not apply, end quote. Paradoxically, this interpretation also meant that the Northwest Ordinance could not altogether outlaw slavery in Michigan. Augustus B. Woodward, the chief judge of the Territorial Supreme Court, pointed out that Jay's treaty with England guaranteed the property rights of the existing settlers, that, quote, the term property as used in Jay's treaty includes slaves, as slaves were recognized as property by the countries France and England concerned, end quote, and that before, quote, and that therefore, quote, slaves living on May 31st, 1793, and in the possession of settlers in this territory on July 11th, 1796, the date when the United States finally took possession of Wayne County, continue such for life. Children of such slaves born between these dates continued in servitude for 25 years under the provisions of Upper Canada's Gradual Emancipation Act of 1793. Children of such children and all born after July 11, 1796 are free from birth. End quote. Even in the South, the positive law doctrine implied strict territorial limitation. In Rankin versus Lydia, 1820, to cite only one of numerous examples, the Kentucky Court of Appeals held that slavery was, quote, without foundation in the law of nature or the common law, end quote, but existed by virtue of positive law alone. Moreover, it appeared that once the sanction was removed, slavery could not be restored. Only the French reinstituted slavery after first abolishing it. Yet American states often vacillated on other prohibitions, such as the outlawing of capital punishment or the sale of intoxicating drink. The reestablishment of slavery would have raised serious constitutional debates, even in states like Pennsylvania, where the courts refused to give an emancipationist construction to the state constitution's Declaration of Rights. Emancipation proposals were debated in the Upper South and were long resisted in New York and New Jersey, but this apparent convergence should not blind us to the momentous implications of drawing free soil boundaries. Soon after the adoption of the Constitution, a Federalist complained in the American Museum about the unconstitutionality of Pennsylvania's sojourner law, which required foreigners, quote unquote, who resided with their Negro servants at the seat of government, Philadelphia, to leave the state after 6 months or lose their slaves. Quote, if it be just and right for the law of nations to deprive a foreigner of his property in a slave from principles of conscience and religion, may not a nation believing in metempsychosis by the same law deprive a British friend or other good man residing among them of his ox or his ass or any living thing that is his? End quote. Clearly, it would be impolitic for a modern nation to invalidate the marriage, divorce, or familial legitimacy of a traveler or resident alien. In general, English law followed Roman precedent and granted that a person's status is defined by the laws of his domicile and accompanies him wherever he goes. In his monumental Commentaries on the Conflict of Laws, Story endorsed the maxims of Bolognais and other continental authorities on the capacity of persons. Quote, laws purely personal, whether universal or particular, extend themselves everywhere. That is to say, a man is everywhere deemed in the same state by which he is affected by the law of his domicile. Wherever a law is directed to the person, we are to refer to the law of the place to which he is personally subject. End quote. Traditionally, the courts of various nations had upheld certain customs and practices unrecognized by local law. In the United States, moreover, each state was bound to give full faith and credit to the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state. On the other hand, the principle of extraterritoriality could not be extended indefinitely without subverting public policy and infringing upon state sovereignty. An influx of aliens carrying their own laws and customs with them could rapidly transform the institutional structure of any given society. Thus, according to Story, the comity of nations depends entirely on voluntary consent and, quote, is inadmissible when it is contrary to a nation's known policy or prejudicial to its interests, end quote. No foreign state was obliged to recognize laws incompatible with its own interests, and, quote, whatever may be the intrinsic or obligatory force of such laws upon such persons, if they should return to their native country, they can have none in other nations wherein they reside, end quote. In effect, these were the broad principles underlying the Somerset and Knight decisions. It was not necessary to offer convincing evidence that England or Scotland were in danger of becoming slave societies. The courts simply assumed that all residents were under the jurisdiction of municipal law, the principles of which would be violated by granting comity to colonial slave law. Story, who discussed slavery after considering forms of prohibited marriages, asserted that, quote, there is a uniformity of opinion among foreign jurists and foreign tribunals in giving no effect to the state of slavery of a party, whatever it might have been in the country of his birth or that in which he had been previously domiciled, unless it is also recognized by the laws of the country of his actual domicile and where he is found. End quote. But these general rules left important questions unresolved. Did refusal to give effect, quote unquote, mean an irreversible change of status and thus a contravening of the laws of the original domicile? Could the status of slavery be suspended and then reattached, as Lord Stowell had said? Was there a grace period before public policy took effect, as the 6-month sojourner laws seemed to suggest? Above all, could the law assimilate anti-slavery principles in one jurisdiction and still provide the means for a mutually acceptable resolution of conflicts with slaveholding jurisdictions? These questions take us far beyond even an elastic age of revolution, and also involve legal complexities manifested in a vast multitude of judicial cases. A brief summary will indicate some of the ways in which anti-slavery and pro-slavery principles gradually weakened the conciliatory mechanisms of law. As an initial qualification, it should be emphasized that the deepening controversies over slavery coincided with parallel trends in constitutional theory and in the theory of legal conflict, trends which reinforced the sanctions for particularism and territorial sovereignty. Thomas R. Cobb, a 19th century Georgian and leading authority on the jurisprudence of slavery, acknowledged that public policy must always take precedence over the principle of comity. He contended, however, that the mere transit of a master and slave could in no way infringe upon the rights, liberties, or interests of a non-slaveholding people. Cobb admitted that at the time of the Somerset and Knight cases, colonial slaveholders were abusing the privilege of temporary residence in Britain. John Wedderburn, the owner of Joseph Knight, had been domiciled in Scotland for several years, had allowed Knight to marry, and had furnished no proof of his intent to return to Jamaica, though Stewart claimed an intent to return to Virginia after completing business transactions. He had resided in England for more than a year when Somerset escaped. Cobb felt that residence should have been the point at issue rather than the irrelevant question of whether British municipal law prohibited the introduction of slavery. It is difficult to dispute the logic of Cobb's position so long as one accepts his premise that slavery is analogous to other statuses and contracts which deserve the respect of all nations. He was consistent enough to grant that a slave like Joseph Knight might legitimately be emancipated by the mere fact of acquiring domicile in a free jurisdiction, and that such a freedom could carry his uh, sorry, such a freed man would carry his new status wherever he went. For a time, even Southern courts gave support to this position. Thus, in 1833, a slave woman was emancipated in Virginia because her master had taken her to Massachusetts, his original home, with the intent of settling there. Though he returned to Virginia, his residence in Boston had reinstituted his original character as a man of Massachusetts, and the slave whose destiny was linked with his had ceased to belong to Virginia. As late as 1850, a South Carolina court freed a Negro who had been taken to Ireland since his deceased master had consented to his manumission, and the master's widow had brought him back against his will to South Carolina. A Louisiana court ruled that it was not in the power of a former owner to re enslave a Negro woman who had been taken to France to learn hairdressing. The Northwest Territories presented special problems because of the disputes over the Northwest Ordinance, the delay in British military evacuation from Northwest posts, and the wording of later state constitutions. Uh, oh, const- Even Judge Woodward, who in Michigan defended the strongest abolitionist principles, conceded that Canadian law continued to sanction a qualified form of slavery in Michigan. In 1821, the Virginia Court of Appeals, in the case of Lewis versus Fullerton, refused to accept temporary residence in Ohio as a ground for freedom, notwithstanding a habeas corpus judgment in Ohio in favor of the slave. In Rankin versus Lydia, 1820, the Kentucky Court of Appeals agreed that the Northwest Ordinance applied only to settlers and inhabitants and not to transients. But since Lydia had lived in Indiana Territory for 7 years, had been sold there and brought back to Kentucky, where she had been sold again, the court ruled that her residence in Indiana had annulled the original sale. The purchaser had no right to Lydia while she remained in Indiana. Quote, "And is it to be seriously contended," Justice Benjamin Mills asked, "that so soon as he transported her to the Kentucky shore, the noxious atmosphere of this state, without any express law for the purpose, clamped upon her newly forged chains of slavery after the old ones were destroyed?" End quote. The principle of comity, he concluded, required that Lydia's freedom be as sacred in Kentucky as if it had been her birthright. Even the famous case of Graham versus Strader, 1844, excuse me, which seemed to reverse the principles of Rankin, did not challenge the view that a slave would acquire permanent freedom if held for more than a temporary sojourn in a free state. Rather, the decision resembled that of Lord Stowell in the slave grace, quote unquote, which was cited as a precedent. Justice Thomas Alexander Marshall of the Kentucky Court of Appeals held that a master who took his slave temporarily to a free state with no intention of residing there could not be judged as renouncing his right of dominion. In other words, the laws of the non-slave holding jurisdiction might require the temporary suspension of the master's legal right to enforce dominion, but this suspension was not the same as emancipation. Kentucky was under no obligation to recognize a man as free merely because he could have claimed his freedom while in Ohio. Marshall thought it unnecessary to deal with the more prickly question that would be raised if an Ohio court specifically granted freedom to a transient slave from Kentucky. He implied that a slave state had no duty to recognize the decision of a foreign tribunal, which disregarded mutual comity. Following Stoll, Marshall further maintained that the master-slave relationship could not be dissolved by the mere fact of temporary residence in an area that had a general prohibition against slavery. In denying an appeal to the United States Supreme Court, Chief Justice Roger Taney held that the laws of Kentucky alone had jurisdiction over a slave who had been in Ohio, and that the laws of Ohio had no peculiar force by virtue of the Ordinance of 1787, which had been wholly superseded by state and federal constitutions. I think I'm going to have to go get some water to finish this out. So if you'll bear with me just a minute. Mm, yeah, definitely. Because I think I've got about 8 or 10 pages left, which isn't a lot, but with no water, my voice isn't going to handle it. So I will be right back. Give me just 1 minute. Okay. Oops. Let's get back to it. Now that I have some water. Okay, these guiding principles were only partially challenged by the ostensibly liberal decisions of New England courts. Thus, in Commonwealth versus Aves, 1836, Justice Lemuel Shaw took pride in the fact that slavery had been abolished in Massachusetts prior to the adoption of the federal constitution, quote, as being contrary to the principles of justice and of nature and repugnant to the principles of the Declaration of Rights, which is a component part of the Constitution of the state, end quote. All persons coming within the limits of the state were entitled to the privileges of the law. The only constitutional provision for protecting the interests of slaveholding states, Shaw maintained, was limited to slaves who escaped without the consent of their owners into other states. The comity of nations could not be extended to an institution, quote, entirely inconsistent with our policy and our fundamental principles, end quote. Shaw admitted, however, that decisions in both England and America had shown slavery not to be contrary to the law of nations. If slaves became free upon entering Massachusetts, it was, quote, not so much because any alteration is made to their status, as because there is no law which will warrant, but there are laws if they choose to avail themselves of them, which prohibit their forcible detention uh, or forcible removal. End quote. Moreover, the privileges of municipal law did not apply to fugitives or probably to bondsmen in transit to a state where slavery was allowed, quote, where by accident or necessity he is compelled to touch or land therein in a free state, remaining no longer than necessary, end quote. These maxims were extended and refined in the classic case of Polydor versus Prince, 1837. Judge Asher Ware of the Federal District Court of Maine admitted that the law of nations obliged courts to recognize the validity, at least to some extent, of other communities' statutes regarding persons. This obligation was stronger, however, with respect to statuses founded on nature, such as marriage or parenthood, than with respect to those resulting from, quote, mere civil institutions, end quote. This distinction had been ably questioned by John Dunning in the Somerset trial. Ware conceded that American and English law determined status by the law of the holder's domicile and the incidence of status by the law of the place where any such incident was exercised. Story, for example, had pointed out that while marital status, quote, accompanies a man everywhere, end quote, the rule of universality, quote, does not militate against the law of the country where the consequences of that status are sought to be enforced, end quote. But whereas a marriage would not be dissolved simply by denying some of its legal incidents or consequences, where could not see how a court could recognize a foreigner's artificial status and at the same time refuse, quote, to adopt all those subsidiary laws of his domicile which regulate and protect him in the enjoyment of his personal status, end quote. In short, a free state could not acknowledge the relationship between master and slave and then deny all its legal consequences. Davy had made the same point in defending Somerset. Logically, the abstract status of slavery depended on the legal incapacities subsumed under the incidence of status, yet Ware dealt gingerly with the question of altered status. He inter I'm sorry, he interpreted Shaw's dictum in Commonwealth versus Aves to mean that there was no change in the slave's personal state with respect to the laws of the country he had left. Thus, Ware confirmed Lord Stowell's judgment that the state of slavery was merely suspended and might reattach to the Negro if he should return to his former domicile. Much earlier, English courts had gravitated toward a compromise position that avoided direct challenge to colonial law. The opinions of eminent American jurists like Story, Shaw, and Ware were delivered in much the same spirit, although their emphasis on the territorial sovereignty of northern states served only to sanction the sovereignty of southern states. There were strong grounds for a national legal consensus. Slaves who escaped into the free states without the consent of their masters must be returned to their masters. But if a master voluntarily took a slave into a free state with any intention of residing there, the slave became free. The widening gray area concerned the effects of transit or a temporary sojourn, and the obligation of slave jurisdictions to respect a change of status was defined by the policy of non-slaveholding jurisdictions. To the sober legal mind, it appeared that if slavery itself was unknown to English common law, the triumph of an adapted common law in 19th century America could help reconcile conflicting jurisdictions within an overarching system of consistent, rational, and universal principles. The harmonizing power of reason could offset the impetus demands of the human heart, quote unquote. Oof, I suddenly got really droopy. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to sit up straight here. Whew. That's the way it is. Thomas Cobb, for example, argued that public feeling had distorted both the issues and judgment in the Somerset case, but Cobb ignored the relevance of public feeling to public policy. When the people had come to see slavery as an odious institution, any protection given to transient masters would be interpreted as a complicity in crime and as an infringement upon the liberties of all the people. For Granville Sharp, the moral and legal issues would have been the same if Somerset had been the only slave in England and had resided there for only a day. In the Knight case, the Master's Council maintained that one could not presume that the municipal laws of any country were unjust. Therefore, on principle of equity, the Scottish courts should presume the lawfulness of Jamaican slavery. But this gambit encouraged the court to move beyond Lord Mansfield's position and to decide not only that Jamaican law was without effect in Scotland, but that it violated universal principles of justice and morality. The Constitution made it far more difficult for American courts to impeach local slave codes in accordance with higher law principles. For the Supreme Court of the land, expressly stipulated that, quote, no person held in service of labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall in consequence of any law or regulation therein be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the property of the party to whom such service or labor may be due, end quote. Some northern jurists insist that if it were not for this clause, a slave would be automatically emancipated as a result of Mansfield's interpretation of common law upon fleeing to a free state. But given the force of the Constitution, this view could only be an inducement to non-cooperation. And non-cooperation, like higher law principles, could work both ways. Missouri courts, for example, had long accepted Sergeant Davies' argument that a master who chose to reside in free territory did, quote, by such residence declare his slave to have become a free man, end quote. But by 1852, in the portentous case of Dred Scott versus Emerson, the Missouri Supreme Court reversed an earlier judgment of freedom on the grounds that, quote, no state is bound to carry into effect enactments conceived in a spirit hostile to that which pervades her own laws, end quote. Justice William Scott went on to note, quote, times now are not as they were when the former decisions on this subject were made. Since then, not only individuals but states have been possessed with a dark and fell spirit in relation to slavery, whose gratification is sought in the pursuit of measures whose inevitable consequences must be the overthrow and destruction of our government. Under such circumstances, it does not behoove the state of Missouri to show the least countenance to any measure which might gratify this spirit, end quote. We're almost there. A few more pages. Among those hostile measures, according to Justice Scott's famous upholder, was the Missouri Compromise Act, which deprived a citizen of the United States of his property without due process, quote, merely because he brought his property into particular territory of the United States, end quote. Here we have an appeal to higher law, justice of a different kind, and at a time when northern states had moved far toward Granville Sharp's demand at the time of Somerset that courts should enforce common law principles of liberty and abide by the divine law of Deuteronomy 23:15, quote, thou shalt not deliver unto his master the servant which is escaped from his master unto thee, end quote. Sharp had succeeded in making England an asylum for a few James Somersets, if not for the Grace Joneses who returned with their masters prior to 1834 to the West Indies. Partly because of geographic separation, partly because of judicial compromise, Sharp's demand posed no direct threat to colonial slavery, the legality of which Parliament confirmed in 1833 by generous compensation to the owners of slave property. In the United States, however, higher law appeals became something more than goals to be approximated. They became, as it were, transubstantiated into geographic space and national destiny. Logically, one cannot have two conflicting bodies of higher law. The effectiveness of a higher law, like that of any ultimate weapon, depends on its credibility to all concerned. During the early years of the Republic, the abolitionists' appeal to higher law justice appeared innocently theoretical, since all courts agreed that slavery was legal in many jurisdictions and that the law must ultimately mediate conflicts in accordance with the reciprocal interests of the various states. Hence, states like Pennsylvania and New York, when adopting laws for gradual emancipation, specifically allowed for the for the return of fugitives as well as for the temporary sojourn of Southern masters and slaves. Yet, psychologically at least, the Northern abolition laws were acts of self purification, and let us recall William Roscoe's remark regarding the British abolition of the slave trade that, quote, it can be no breach of the law of nations to prevent other countries from a practice which we of ourselves relinquished as contrary to justice and humanity. End quote. These statutes, no matter how qualified, became an affront to slaveholders in neighboring states. As early as the 1790s, masters in Virginia and Maryland bitterly complained that Pennsylvanians were uncooperative in returning fugitives. Frequent attempts to kidnap free blacks under the pretext of recovering runaways intensified the spirit of non cooperation. Systematic legal delays led the Maryland legislature to complain in 1823 that the people were beginning to view Pennsylvania as, quote, a hostile state, end quote. 3 years later, Maryland sent 3 commissioners to negotiate with the Pennsylvania legislature, much as Jamaica had earlier done with Cuba. The federal law was so ineffective, according to Maryland, that it was necessary for the two states, quote, practically to arrange a treaty, end quote. Although the United States Supreme Court finally ruled that Pennsylvania could not interfere in the recovery of fugitives, Prigg versus Pennsylvania, by the 1840s the legislature was ready to prohibit any state judge or official from helping to implement the 1793 federal law. Other northern states passed similar personal liberty acts and also repealed the sojourner laws, which had allowed, on grounds of comity, a temporary residence of masters and slaves. It appeared that self purification could not be reconciled with any complicity in the slave system. Even prior to the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, bolder assertions of territorial sovereignty were matched by bolder appeals to higher law, justice, whereas the Garrisonians condemned the Constitution as a pro slavery document. Other abolitionists and future radical Republicans claimed that slavery was itself unconstitutional in any federal jurisdiction. Thus, in the relatively moderate view of Senator Salmon P. Chase, the Constitution had, quote, found slavery and left it a state institution, the creature and dependent of state law, wholly local in its existence and character, end quote. An institution so directly repugnant to the natural right, to the common law, and to the spirit of the Constitution might be tolerated for a time where it had long been entrenched and where it had received the sanction of municipal law. It could not, however, be recognized by the federal government without subverting the character and mission of the American people. Southern judges had also looked upon slavery as the creature of municipal law, which they had seen as its major shield of defense. Unlike the earlier British defenders of the slave trade, they could not really appeal to the law of nations or to the international custom and practice of merchants. The African slave trade was not yet dead, but it could hardly serve as a touchstone of legitimacy. Indeed, Southerners had often defined Negro slavery as an unfortunate, if necessary, evil bequeathed by British avarice. Thus, in terms of law, American slavery had become increasingly circumscribed by the South's own localism and insistence on state sovereignty, both of which incidentally justified a refusal to recognize the free status and civil rights of Northern or English black seamen who called at Southern ports. Yet the South's legal isolation required mutual comity and respect, which were the only protections against the higher law absolutism of the abolitionists. When it became clear that both comity and respect were waning, Southern leaders demanded that the federal government protect the rights of slaveholders in the common territories on the high seas and in conflicts with free states and nations. For unless such parity could be won, the South would in effect acquiesce to the anti-slavery view of higher law justice, transforming the pretension into a reality. The Southern demands were not unprecedented. During most of the 18th century, the English government had protected the property rights of slaveholders wherever it had jurisdiction. No Southerner could ask for more than Lord Chancellor Hardwicke had granted in 1749 as a matter of course. But during the following century, Anglo-American law increasingly absorbed anti-slavery doctrine as part of its own continuing self-validation. Southern territorial sovereignty to legitimize itself required some external sanction, yet the external law could no longer legitimize slavery without impairing its own legitimacy. In the words of Chase, which echoed the judgments of Sharp, Davy, and Hargrave, quote, "The very moment a slave passed beyond the jurisdiction of the state, he ceased to be a slave, not because any law or regulation of the state which he enters confers freedom upon him, but because he continues to be a man and leaves behind him the law of force which made him a slave." End quote. Against such a doctrine, it appeared one could apply only the law of force. And that is the end of chapter 10. So that leaves us with chapter 11, which is 34 pages long, and then the epilogue is like 4 pages maybe. Oop, 5, 6. It's longer than I thought. It's about 7 or 8 pages. So that's going to be 37 pages. That's going to take a while. I'll have to take a break in the middle of it there somewhere, but I will get it. We will finish this book on Friday. So, with that, have a good night. I'll see you Friday. Merry Christmas.